The fog rolled across right field like a living thing, thick and cold, swallowing the runway in gray silence. October 1942. The war was 9 months old for America, and every airfield from California to Maine hummed with urgency. Pilots training, bombers rolling off assembly lines, fighters being tested against the clock. But this morning, in this corner of Ohio, something different was happening. Something no one was supposed to see. Lieutenant Colonel James Harker stood outside Hangar 7 with his hands buried in his coat pockets, watching the eastern sky. He'd been awake for 36 hours. His eyes burned. His jaw ached from clenching. But he couldn't leave. Not until the Mustang came back. If it came back. The P-51A, tail number 43 to 6003, had departed right field at 0347 hours, alone, unannounced, flying a route that existed on no official flight plan. The pilot, Captain David Ernst, had received his orders in a locked room with no windows. 3 men had been present: Harker, a brigadier general whose name Ernst didn't catch, and a civilian in a dark suit who never spoke. The orders were verbal. Nothing written. Nothing recorded. Fly to coordinates 39.8 degrees north, 84.2 degrees west. Land at the designated strip. Wait for the package. Return immediately. Speak to no one. Ernst had nodded once, asked no questions, and walked out into the pre-dawn darkness. That was 4 hours ago. Now Harker stood in the fog, listening. Around him, right field pretended to be normal. Mechanics worked on P-40 Warhawks in the adjacent hangars. A Douglas C-47 taxied toward the main runway, engines coughing blue smoke. Somewhere a radio crackled with routine chatter. But Hangar 7 sat apart from all of it, quiet, guarded by 2 military policemen who'd been told to shoot anyone who tried to enter without clearance. Even Harker didn't know what was in the package. He knew only that it had come from somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains. That it was small enough to fit in the Mustang's rear fuselage compartment, behind the pilot's seat, in the space normally reserved for emergency equipment. That it weighed approximately 40 pounds. That it was wrapped in lead-lined canvas. And that 3 different intelligence agencies were waiting for it to arrive. The Mustang itself was barely operational. The P-51A was the first production variant of North American aviation's new fighter, rushed into limited service before the bugs were worked out. The RAF had taken the early models and used them for reconnaissance, low-altitude work, tactical photography, quick in-and-out missions. The USAAF was still deciding what to do with them. They were fast, sure. Long-ranged. Agile. But they lacked the high-altitude performance of the P-38 Lightning or the ruggedness of the P-47 Thunderbolt. They were also quiet. That's what had mattered for this mission. Harker checked his watch. 0753 hours. The return window closed at 0800. If Ernst wasn't back by then, procedures changed. Search and rescue would be notified. Questions would be asked. The whole operation, whatever it was, would be compromised. A sound reached him through the fog. Faint. Distant. The smooth, liquid growl of an Allison V-1710 engine. Harker straightened. The MPs turned toward the sound, hands moving instinctively toward their sidearms. From inside Hangar 7, a door opened, and the man in the dark suit appeared, still silent, still unreadable. The debriefing room was 8 feet by 10 feet, with concrete walls, a single fluorescent light, and no windows. Captain David Ernst sat at a gray metal table, still in his flight suit, a cup of cold coffee in front of him that he hadn't touched. Across from him sat Lieutenant Colonel Harker and the man in the dark suit, whose name Ernst still didn't know. A reel-to-reel tape recorder sat on the table, but it wasn't running. That told Ernst everything he needed to know about what kind of conversation this was. Harker leaned forward, elbows on the table. Start from the beginning. Departure from right field. Ernst took a breath. Departed at 0347 as ordered. Climbed to 8,000 feet, heading 270. Clear skies, no moon. Navigation by dead reckoning and compass. At approximately 0425, I began descent toward the coordinates provided. Visibility. Poor. Ground fog in the valleys. I had to drop to 500 feet to find the landing strip. And when you found it? Ernst's jaw tightened. It was crude. A gravel strip carved out of the forest. No lights, no markings. I did a low pass to confirm the runway, then came around for landing. That's when I saw the people. The man in the dark suit spoke for the first time since they'd entered the room. Describe them. 6 men on the ground near the strip. 2 more standing by a truck, civilian vehicle, older model, maybe a Ford. The men were dressed like locals. Work clothes, boots, hats. But they moved like soldiers. Disciplined. Organized. Ernst paused. And they were armed. I saw rifles. Maybe shotguns. Did they signal you? One of them waved me in. No flares, no radio. Just hand signals. And the others? The ones in the trees. Ernst nodded slowly. I didn't see them until after I landed. When I shut down the engine, the silence was heavy. That's when I noticed movement in the tree line. Shadows. At least a dozen men, spread out in a perimeter maybe 50 yards from the strip. They weren't hiding. They wanted to be seen. Hawker exchanged a glance with the man in the dark suit. Did they approach? No. They just watched. Like sentries. Ernst rubbed his face. The 6 men on the ground came toward the aircraft. One of them was carrying the package. Wrapped in canvas, tied with rope. He handed it to me through the cockpit, didn't say a word. I stowed it in the rear compartment, secured it, and signaled that I was ready to depart. And then the man who gave me the package stepped back and nodded toward the trees. Like he was acknowledging them. Permission granted, or something. I started the engine, taxied back to the end of the strip, and took off. The man in the dark suit pulled a folded map from his jacket and spread it on the table. It was a detailed topographical map of southern Ohio and eastern Kentucky. He pointed to a circled area. The landing strip was here. Correct. Ernst studied the map. Yes, right there. Middle of the Daniel Boone National Forest. And the smoke you mentioned. Where was it coming from? Ernst traced a line with his finger, westward from the landing strip. Somewhere in this area. Maybe 10 miles out. I saw it during the climb out, just before I entered the clouds. The man in the dark suit leaned back. What did it look like? Thick. Gray-black. Rising in columns. Not campfire smoke, too much volume, too continuous. Like a coal operation, or... Ernst hesitated. Or a processing facility. Silence filled the room. Harker broke it. Captain, I need you to understand something. What you saw this morning, what you transported, is classified at the highest level. You will not speak of it to anyone. Not your co-pilot. Not your wife. Not your priest. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Good. Harker stood, walked to the corner of the room, and returned with a manila envelope. He opened it and pulled out a series of black and white photographs, laying them on the table one by one. Ernst stared at them. The first photograph showed a valley in the mountains. Dense forest. A river cutting through the center. At the top of the valley, partially obscured by trees, was a cluster of buildings. Low, industrial structures with metal roofs. The second photograph was a closer shot of the same facility. Smokestacks. Railroad tracks. A loading dock. Armed guards at the gates. The third photograph showed men in work clothes, standing beside rail cars filled with barrels. The fourth photograph showed one of the barrels up close. Stenciled on the side, in faded letters, U.S. Army, Ordnance Depth, handle with care. Ernst looked up at Harker. "What is this?" The man in the dark suit answered. "That is what you're not going to ask about." "But, Captain Ernst." The man's voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Ernst stop cold. "There are certain operations underway in this country that exist outside the normal chain of command. They involve resources, materials, and personnel that cannot be accounted for through official channels. What you transported this morning was part of one such operation." "What kind of materials?" "The kind that win wars." The man folded the photographs and slid them back into the envelope. "The kind that end them." Ernst felt something cold settle in his chest. "You're talking about weapons." "I'm talking about necessity." The man stood. "Captain, you did your job. You flew the mission. You brought the package back. And now you're going to forget it ever happened. With all due respect." "There is no respect in this conversation, Captain. There is only obedience." The man buttoned his jacket. "You will return to your regular duties. You will fly test missions, evaluate aircraft, train pilots. And you will never mention the events of this morning again. If you do, you will be court-martialed for violating national security protocols. If you persist, you will disappear. Do you understand?" Ernst looked at Harker. The colonel's face was unreadable. "Yes," Ernst said quietly. "I understand." The man in the dark suit nodded. "Good. You're dismissed." Ernst stood, saluted, and walked to the door. As his hand touched the handle, Harker spoke. "Captain." Ernst turned. "What you did today, it matters. Even if you never know why." Ernst held his gaze for a moment, then nodded and left. When the door closed, Harker turned to the man in the dark suit. "What's really going on?" The man walked to the table, gathered the map and envelope, and tucked them under his arm. "You don't want to know. Try me." The man studied him. "You've heard of the Manhattan Project?" "Rumors. Nothing confirmed." "Keep it that way." The man moved toward the door, then paused. "But for your own information, Colonel, what Captain Ernst brought back this morning wasn't a weapon. It was a component. A very specific component, processed in a very remote facility by people who don't officially exist." "And the men in the trees?" "The ones watching." "Insurance. The project has competitors. People who want to know what we're building. People who would kill to stop us." The man opened the door. "The package is secure now. It's on its way to Oak Ridge. From there." He shrugged. "From there, it becomes someone else's problem." Harker watched him leave. Then he sat alone in the debriefing room, listening to the hum of the fluorescent light, thinking about the Mustang sitting on the tarmac and the 40 pounds of lead-wrapped secrets that had traveled inside it. He thought about Ernst's face, pale, frightened, confused. He thought about the men in the trees, watching with rifles, making sure the exchange happened. He thought about the smoke rising from the hills. And he thought about what was coming, what they were building, what they would unleash. The war was still young. The outcome was still uncertain. But somewhere in the mountains of Kentucky, in a facility that didn't exist, using materials that couldn't be tracked, scientists and soldiers were creating something that would change everything. And a lone Mustang had carried a piece of it through the dawn. Captain David Ernst didn't go back to his barracks. He walked across right field in the pale morning light, past the hangars and the maintenance sheds, past the rows of fighters being prepped for the day's test flights, and into the operations building where the flight logs were kept. He told himself he just needed to check the weather reports, that he was being thorough, that it was routine. but his hands were shaking when he pulled the logbook from the shelf. The P-51A's flight record for October 14, 1942, was blank. No departure time. No destination. No return. 300 miles flown, and not a single line of ink to prove it had happened. Ernst stared at the empty page. Then he closed the book, put it back on the shelf, and walked out. He should have left it there. 4 days later, a man came to see him. Ernst was in the hangar, helping a crew chief troubleshoot an oil leak on AP-40, when someone called his name. He turned to find a lieutenant he'd never seen before, standing at the entrance with his hands in his pockets and an expression that was too casual to be real. "Captain Ernst? Got a minute?" Ernst wiped his hands on a rag. "Who's asking?" "Lieutenant Graves. Intelligence. I need to ask you a few questions about a flight you took last week." The crew chief glanced at Ernst, then went back to work on the P-40. Ernst followed Graves outside, into the cold October air. They walked toward the edge of the airfield, away from the noise and the people. When they were alone, Graves stopped and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. He offered one to Ernst, who shook his head. Graves lit his own and took a long drag. "So, October 14th. Early morning. You flew AP-51 out of right field. Where'd you go?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "Captain, I'm not here to jam you up. I'm here because some people are concerned." "What people?" "The kind who ask questions when classified cargo disappears." Graves exhaled smoke. "See, here's the thing. That package you picked up? It was supposed to go to Oak Ridge. But it never arrived." Ernst felt his chest tighten. "That's not possible. I delivered it to the transport vehicle. 2 MPs took it away." "Yeah, that's what the report says. But the vehicle never reached Oak Ridge. And the MPs?" Graves shrugged. "They're missing. Missing. Gone. Along with the package. Along with any record of what was in it." Graves flicked ash from his cigarette. "Which means somebody intercepted them. Somebody who knew the route, the timing, and the contents." Ernst stared at him. "You think I had something to do with it? I think you're the only person who can tell me what really happened that morning." "I told you everything. In the debriefing." "Tell me again." So Ernst did. He described the flight, the landing strip, the men on the ground, the watchers in the trees. He described the smoke rising from the hills. He described the package, 40 pounds, wrapped in lead-lined canvas, secured in the Mustang's rear compartment. Graves listened without interrupting. When Ernst finished, the lieutenant nodded slowly. "The men in the trees. You said they were armed." "Yes." "And they didn't try to stop you?" "No. They just watched." "Why?" Ernst frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if they were guarding the package, why let you take it? If they were hostile, why not shoot you down? If they were neutral, why be there at all?" Graves took another drag. "Unless they were making sure the handoff happened. Unless they wanted you to take the package. That doesn't make sense." "Doesn't it?" Graves dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. "Captain, I'm going to tell you something, and you're not going to repeat it. The facility where that package came from? It's not just processing materials for the Manhattan Project. It's also processing materials for other interested parties." "Other parties?" "People who think the war should end differently. People who don't trust Roosevelt. People who want leverage." Graves lowered his voice. "That package you picked up? It might not have been what you thought it was." Ernst felt cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying somebody played you. The people on the ground, the watchers in the trees, they weren't protecting the package. They were making sure it got to where it needed to go. And then, when it was in transit to Oak Ridge, they hit the convoy and took it. That's insane. Is it? Captain, there are people in this country who would do anything to stop the Manhattan Project. And there are people who would do anything to steal it. And right now, you're the only link between the two. Ernst stepped back. I didn't do anything wrong. I followed orders. I know. But the problem is, somebody's going to need a scapegoat. And unless we find that package, you're it. Then find it. I'm trying. Graves pulled a folded photograph from his jacket and handed it to Ernst. Recognize this? It was an aerial photograph, grainy and dark, taken from high altitude. It showed the same landing strip Ernst had used, the gravel runway, the trees, the truck. But there was something else in the photo. Something Ernst hadn't seen during his landing. A second aircraft. Parked in the trees, camouflaged with branches and netting. Small. Single engine. A civilian plane, maybe a Piper or a Stinson. Ernst looked up at Graves. What is this? That's what was waiting after you left. That's how they moved the real package. The real package? Captain, what you picked up that morning. It was a decoy. The actual cargo was already loaded onto that plane. Your mission was just cover, a way to draw attention away from the real operation. Ernst felt like the ground was tilting. You're saying I was set up. I'm saying you were used. Graves took the photograph back. And now the people who used you are trying to erase the evidence. The MPs are dead. The transport vehicle was found burned out in a ditch outside Cincinnati. And the package? He shook his head. Gone. Then why are you telling me this? Because I need your help. Graves met his eyes. I need you to remember everything you saw that morning. Every detail. Every face. Every sound. Because somewhere in your memory is a clue that's going to lead me to whoever took that package. Ernst thought about the men on the ground, the watchers in the trees, the smoke rising from the hills. He thought about the man in the dark suit, and the way he'd said, there are certain operations underway in this country that exist outside the normal chain of command. He thought about the empty page in the logbook. I can't help you, Ernst said quietly. Can't or won't? Does it matter? Graves studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. No, I suppose it doesn't. He turned to walk away, then stopped. Captain, one more thing. That Mustang you flew? 43 to 6003. What about it? It's been grounded. Maintenance issues, officially. But the real reason? Graves smiled thinly. Somebody doesn't want you flying it again. Somebody doesn't want you anywhere near that aircraft. He walked away, leaving Ernst standing alone on the edge of the airfield, the wind cold against his face, the truth settling over him like fog. He'd been a courier. Nothing more. A pilot following orders, flying a route he didn't understand, carrying cargo he wasn't allowed to question. But the cargo had been a lie. The mission had been a lie. And now 2 men were dead, a package was missing, and somewhere in the mountains of Kentucky a secret was burning. Ernst looked back at the hangars, at the rows of fighters gleaming in the pale sunlight. He thought about the war and the things they were building to win it. The bombs and the bullets and the secrets wrapped in lead. He thought about the choice he'd made that morning, to take the package, to ask no questions, to do his duty. And he wondered if that choice had just killed him. Captain David Ernst never flew another mission. On October 22, 1942, 8 days after his flight to the mountains, he was transferred from Wright Field to a training facility in Texas. No explanation. No ceremony. Just orders signed by an officer whose name didn't appear in any official registry. Ernst packed his duffel, said goodbye to no one, and boarded a transport plane heading west. He never saw Lieutenant Graves again. He never learned what happened to the package. And he never spoke about the morning he flew a P-51 into the hills and came back with something that shouldn't have existed. Lieutenant Colonel James Harker stayed at Wright Field for another 6 months. He oversaw test flights, evaluated new aircraft, wrote reports that were read by men he never met. But at night, alone in his quarters, he would pull out the folded map the man in the dark suit had left behind, the one showing the landing strip, the smoke, the facility hidden in the trees. He would study it, tracing the routes with his finger, wondering what had really happened that morning. In December, he received a letter. No return address. No signature. Just a single typed sentence. The asset was recovered. No further action required. Harker burned the letter. He burned the map. And he never asked another question. The man in the dark suit disappeared from Wright Field the same day the MPs went missing. No one knew his name. No one knew who he worked for. He simply stopped appearing, and the Air Corps had no record of him ever being there. But his work continued. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, scientists working on the Manhattan Project received a critical component in November 1942, a 40-pound container of processed uranium, refined in a facility that didn't exist, transported by routes that couldn't be traced. The component arrived in perfect condition, on schedule, and without incident. No one asked where it came from. No one needed to know. The Mustang, tail number 43-6003, was officially retired in January 1943. Maintenance records cited structural fatigue, though the aircraft had logged fewer than 200 flight hours. It was disassembled, the parts catalogued and stored in a warehouse in Ohio, and the fuselage melted down for scrap. The rear compartment, where the package had been stored, was removed separately and incinerated. No explanation was given. Ernst spent the rest of the war training pilots in Texas and California. He was a good instructor, patient and precise, and his students respected him. He never talked about his combat experience, though he had none. He never talked about classified missions, though everyone assumed he'd flown them. In 1945, when the war ended, he left the Air Corps. He returned to his hometown in Pennsylvania, married a schoolteacher, and opened a hardware store. He lived a quiet life. He raised 2 children. He voted in every election and attended church on Sundays. And he never flew again. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The war ended shortly after, and the world learned for the first time about the Manhattan Project, the vast, secret effort to build the most powerful weapon in human history. Ernst read about it in the newspaper, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the morning light spread across the fields. He read about the scientists and the engineers, the factories and the laboratories, the uranium mines and the processing facilities. He read about Oak Ridge and Los Alamos and Hanford. He read about the billions of dollars and the thousands of workers and the years of secrecy. And he thought about the morning in October 1942, when he flew a lone Mustang into the mountains and came back with 40 pounds of something wrapped in lead. He thought about the men on the ground and the watchers in the trees. He thought about the smoke rising from the hills. And he wondered if what he'd carried that morning had ended up in the bombs that ended the war. He never found out. Decades later, in 1987, a researcher working on a history of the Manhattan Project discovered a classified document in the National Archives. It was a single page, heavily redacted, dated October 1942. The document described a special transport operation involving an experimental fighter aircraft and a critical component for the Oak Ridge facility. The names of the pilot and the transport personnel were blacked out. The origin of the component was listed only as Site 7 Bravo, with no further details. The disposition of the component was marked simply, "Delivered." At the bottom of the page, in faint handwriting, someone had written a note. Never happened. Never speak of it. The researcher made a copy of the document and tried to follow up. He submitted FOIA requests. He interviewed retired military officers. He searched for Site 7 Bravo in every available database. He found nothing. The site had been erased. The records destroyed. The people involved scattered or dead. The only evidence that the mission had ever occurred was a single line in a logbook at Wright Field, an entry that had been added years later by an unknown hand. P-51A, 43 to 6003. Special Operations Flight. Classified. No further details available. In 1998, David Ernst died in his sleep at the age of 79. He was buried in a small cemetery in Pennsylvania with full military honors. His children and grandchildren attended. His friends from the hardware store came, and his neighbors, and the men he'd trained decades earlier who had gone on to fly in Korea and Vietnam. At the service, his daughter found a box among his belongings. Inside was his old flight suit, neatly folded, and a faded photograph of a P-51 Mustang, sitting alone on a foggy runway. On the back of the photograph, in her father's handwriting, were 4 words. Some things stay secret. She kept the photograph. She never asked what it meant. The truth is this. In the autumn of 1942, a lone fighter returned to Wright Field carrying something that shouldn't have existed. The cargo was removed in secret, transported by men whose names were never recorded, delivered to a facility working on a project that would change the course of human history. And then the cargo vanished from the official record. The flight vanished. The people involved vanished. What remained was only the story, incomplete, redacted, whispered in the hallways of classified facilities, buried in archives that few would ever see. A story about a Mustang that flew into the mountains before dawn. A story about 40 pounds wrapped in lead. A story about the things we did to win the war, and the secrets we kept to live with what we'd done. In the end, Captain David Ernst did his duty. He followed orders. He asked no questions. He carried the package and brought it home. And for the rest of his life, he carried the weight of not knowing what it was, or what it became, or how many lives it saved or ended. That was the price of secrecy. That was the cost of 1942. That was the burden of the lone Mustang that returned with cargo no one could ever speak of again.